I thought surviving cancer was the hardest fight of my life, until I discovered the person I trusted most had been quietly building a case against me. Years of love twisted into evidence. Now I don't even know who I am anymore. Welcome to Reddit Toxic Family Telltales channel. New episode every day. I went into labor at 3 in the morning, completely alone. Why? Because my husband Charles ignored his phone for 6 straight hours. 6 hours. I called, I texted, nothing. Do you know how terrifying it is to feel your body breaking open while the one person who swore to protect you is unreachable? And here's the thing, this wasn't even the first time he'd abandoned me when I needed him most. The first time was when I thought I was miscarrying at just 10 weeks. I was doubled over, bleeding on the bathroom floor, and he still didn't come. The second time? My dad had a heart attack. I begged Charles to drive me to the hospital, he never showed. So by the time I was giving birth to our daughter, I guess I should have known better than to expect anything. When I finally brought our baby home, do you know what I found? Charles sprawled out on the couch, unconscious, a needle in his arm, while our newborn was screaming for food. I shook him awake, furious, and told him flat out, "Get clean or get out." That's when he grabbed my hands. He looked at me like some tragic movie character and swore that one day, when I was old or sick or falling apart, he'd be there for me. He said that's what marriage was all about, standing by each other, clean or not. And for a moment, I almost believed him. For about 6 months, it actually looked like he meant it. He went to AA every single day. Got a job at his uncle's warehouse. He did night feedings with our baby so I could rest. And every Tuesday at his group, he'd brag about how I was his angel. The leader even invited me to come speak once, and Charles held my hand the entire time like I was his lifeline. But you know how cracks always start small? First, he missed my birthday for a mandatory work thing that turned out to be optional. Then he forgot our anniversary completely, and when I mentioned it, he sneered that I shouldn't need a date to know he loved me. When I got promoted to charge nurse, something I worked my butt off for, he pouted for 3 days straight, making sarcastic comments about how nice it must be to have time for career moves while he was stuck in recovery. And then I found out from a friend that he was telling people at meetings I treated him like a prisoner. Me? I hadn't checked his phone or tracked his whereabouts in months. Then came the winter flu. I was bedridden for a week, shaking with fever. He camped out on the couch and didn't so much as bring me a glass of water. When I asked why, he said he couldn't risk missing work. Later, when I confronted him, he just shrugged and called me dramatic over a little cold. But then came the day everything changed. I was in the shower when I found a lump in my breast. My whole body went cold. I called for Charles, but he couldn't hear me. He had headphones on, gaming like a teenager. I scheduled the biopsy myself. Reminded him 3 times. He still forgot. The results? Stage 2 cancer. When I told him, his face went pale, and then he muttered that medical stuff triggered his recovery. Can you imagine? I said I understood, but inside it felt like swallowing glass. My mother didn't even ask, she moved in the next week. She drove me to every chemo appointment, sat with me through every treatment. Meanwhile, Charles always managed to be somewhere else. Still, I wore my wedding ring through it all. The same ring I wore when I slaved away at 2 jobs to pay for his rehab. 8 months of hell later, I beat it. Charles threw this massive survivor party, plastered my face all over his social media, writing about how he'd supported his warrior wife. Reality check, he came to 2 appointments. Both times he sat in the waiting room scrolling his phone. 3 years went by. I tried to forget what his promises used to sound like. Then one night, my phone rang at 2 a.m. county jail. Charles had relapsed, gotten a DUI, and totaled our car. His voice was slurred as he begged me to bail him out, and he actually had the audacity to say, "You know I was there for your cancer." That's when I laughed. Not a bitter laugh, a real one. Because the audacity was almost funny. I told him, "You were there for Instagram. My mother was there for cancer." And then I hung up and rolled over next to my new husband, the oncology nurse who literally held my hair while I vomited during chemo. Charles lost his job, his apartment, even his parents wouldn't take him back because he'd stolen from them too many times. Last I heard, he was crashing in the same homeless shelter where I once volunteered during his first rehab. I might have made the very bed he sleeps in now. And honestly, at first I didn't care. I thought cutting him out was the right thing. But then came the call. His lawyer's office. I sat across from Rachel Torres, a woman with a sleek leather folder thicker than a phone book. She opened it slowly, savoring it, and started laying pages out on the conference table like she was dealing cards in Vegas. The first? A text I'd sent 2 years ago. I told Charles if he missed Emma's birthday, I'd never forgive him. She highlighted the word never in neon yellow, like that alone was proof I was a monster. The next page? A transcript from an AA meeting where Charles claimed I'd threatened to take Emma away if he relapsed. And someone had actually recorded it. Page after page piled up while Rachel talked about emotional abuse and parental alienation and painted Charles as a devoted father just trying to do right. She kept stacking until half the table was buried, then slid a custody petition toward me, full custody for Charles, with me allowed supervised visits twice a month. At the bottom? A demand for $3,000 in spousal support. Based on my nurse's salary. Because apparently his unemployment was trauma from our marriage. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even pick up the papers. Rachel coolly told me I had 10 days to respond, but Charles might settle for joint custody if I agreed to the support payments. I stumbled out of that office like my legs were made of water. Made it to my car. And threw up right there in the parking garage. I called Evan, the man who actually stood by me. He heard me sobbing before I even said a word. He abandoned his hospital shift, risked a write-up, just to sit in that garage with me for 3 hours while our daughter slept in her car seat. We went through every single piece of Charles's evidence. Evan kept pointing at the dates, showing me that Charles had been building this case while I was literally paying for his recovery. That night, I didn't sleep a single minute. I kept replaying every argument, every harsh word, wondering if maybe I had been cruel without realizing it. Evan held me. But he didn't lie. He didn't say it would be okay because we both knew it might not be. The next morning, I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I emptied Emma's college fund, 3 years of careful saving, $12,000. I handed it over to David Brennan, a lawyer who specialized in custody battles involving addiction. Brennan combed through Charles's file for 2 hours. Finally, he looked at me and said, "Here's the problem, family courts love a redemption story. The good news is, this documentation reeks of manipulation. The bad news? Judges don't always see it that way." He told me we had to document everything starting now and file for emergency custody before Charles pulled another stunt. 5 days later, I got the call. The daycare director. Charles had shown up, claiming it was his visitation day, except we didn't even have a custody agreement yet. She told me Emma was crying while Charles told her that, "Mommy won't let me see you." I drove there so fast I'm shocked I didn't get arrested. When I arrived, Charles was crouched beside Emma, whispering that he'd been sick but now he was better, and that Mommy was mean for keeping them apart. The director had already called the cops, but Charles left before they showed up. That night, he posted a selfie on Facebook, red-eyed and crying outside the daycare, accusing me of keeping his daughter away. 3 days later, Brennan filed for an emergency custody order. My stomach dropped when he told me the hearing wouldn't be for 2 weeks. 2 weeks felt like forever. And in the meantime? Charles's Facebook post exploded, over 300 comments, strangers calling me a monster, accusing me of tearing a child from her father. People I'd never met suddenly thought they knew my entire life. That's when my mom flew in from Florida, carrying this beat-up cardboard box she'd been hiding in her garage. Inside? Every single appointment card for my chemo treatments. 47 hospital parking receipts. Photos she'd secretly saved, me pale and broken, her holding my hand while Charles was nowhere to be found. She looked me in the eye and said, "I kept everything. I knew this day might come." At the emergency hearing, I thought this box would finally show the truth. But Judge Patricia Hoffman barely glanced at it. Instead, she spent 20 minutes praising Charles. She called his commitment to recovery inspiring and said she was impressed by his dedication to rebuilding a relationship with Emma. She gave him supervised visitation every Saturday at a court facility. When Brennan brought up how Charles had abandoned me during cancer, the judge shook her head and said, "Addiction is a disease. We don't punish people for being sick." That first supervised visit? A disaster. The court supervisor wrote in her notes that Charles told Emma, "Daddy was very sick, but Mommy wouldn't help him get better." The supervisor labeled it concerning, but apparently not serious enough to restrict access. Emma came home asking me why I hadn't helped Daddy when he was sick. My daughter was confused, torn, and I had to choke back my anger just to answer her gently. And then Charles found a new AA group across town. Fresh audience, people who didn't know his history. He started spinning lies that I had weaponized his addiction, that I'd used his disease as a weapon to steal his daughter. 3 of these brand new friends even wrote glowing character letters for his lawyer, calling him a devoted father and me cruel. That night, I broke down in the kitchen, ugly crying into my hands. Evan found me, pulled me against his chest while I shook with rage. Then he grabbed a yellow legal pad and said the words that changed everything. "We start documenting everything. Right now." The next morning, we went to Target and bought this big notebook with a little lock on it. Every text got printed, taped in, time-stamped in the margins. Every pickup and drop-off logged, Emma's mood, what Charles said, what he didn't say. Evan even started taking before and after photos. Emma leaving in neat braids, coming home with tangled hair, sometimes still in the same clothes we'd sent her in. That notebook filled up so fast we had to buy a second within a month. Then Brennan called. He was trying to get Charles's old AA records, the ones from the first group where people actually knew the truth. But the leader refused, citing confidentiality. Even with a subpoena, it wouldn't budge. Brennan filed for a court order, but the judge said we'd need another hearing. Translation? Another $3,000 in legal fees and 6 more weeks of waiting. Our first custody mediation came on a Tuesday morning, in this beige conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and despair. Charles walked in wearing a brand new suit, Rachel at his side, looking smug. When the mediator asked him to speak, Charles launched into a performance. Tears streaming down his face as he talked about how I'd never supported his recovery, how my coldness triggered his relapse. Rachel whipped out a letter from a therapist I'd never even heard of, diagnosing him with PTSD from our toxic marriage. The mediator nodded along, jotting notes like she was watching some inspiring Hallmark movie. Then it was my turn. I barely got 2 minutes in before she cut me off and said we should focus on the future, not the past. She suggested a graduated visitation schedule, every other weekend at first, leading up to 50-50 custody within 6 months. I brought up my cancer, how he abandoned me, and she actually said, past medical issues shouldn't prevent a parent from building a future relationship with their child. I wanted to scream. Brennan kicked me under the table before I could. Later, in the hallway, he whispered that mediators always push for shared custody. Always. That evening, my phone rang. Dr. Vasquez, my oncologist. My mother had reached out, and Dr. Vasquez was furious when she heard what was happening. She offered to testify, to tell the court how I came alone to chemo, how she'd watched me vomiting in the parking lot and then call an Uber home because I had no one to drive me. She said she had notes in my file about my lack of support system. She was ready to tell any judge who'd listen. And then a week later I got a Facebook message from Tommy, Charles's uncle. He said he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Charles hadn't been working extra shifts during my cancer like he claimed. He'd been getting high in the warehouse bathroom. Tommy covered for him, even drove him home once when he couldn't stand. He said he wanted to testify whatever it took. But Rachel must have caught wind because the very next day she filed a motion to exclude Dr. Vasquez's testimony, calling it irrelevant to current custody issues and prejudicial against a parent in recovery. And then she pulled a dirty trick, demanded my entire medical history, claiming they needed to verify if I was physically and mentally stable enough to care for Emma. Brennan said it was classic intimidation tactics. Didn't make it sting any less. Around that time, Emma started having nightmares. She'd wake up crying that Daddy was going to take her away. At drop-offs she clung to me, begging not to go. I documented every nightmare in our notebook, even filmed some of her sobbing. When Charles found out, he accused me of coaching her. He demanded she be evaluated by a child psychologist to prove I wasn't poisoning her against him. The court-appointed doctor, Jennifer Mills, scheduled separate sessions. With me, Emma was bubbly, talking about preschool, playing with blocks. With Charles? She went silent, glued to his side, even when he pulled out a whole bag of new toys like a magician trying to buy her love. Dr. Mills scribbled notes but gave nothing away. Meanwhile, Brennan dug into Charles's finances and found he hadn't filed taxes in 3 years. He owed the IRS $47,000. When we brought this up, Rachel brushed it off as another symptom of his disease of addiction, and actually argued that unpaid taxes were a medical condition. I swear, I almost laughed in court. 3 weeks later, we were back in front of Judge Hoffman. This time, she focused on something in Dr. Mills's notes, Emma's nightmares. But instead of blaming Charles, she suggested the nightmares might be signs of parental alienation. She ordered us into family therapy together. The first session? Exactly what I expected. Charles spoke in this soft, broken voice, so quiet the therapist had to lean in just to hear. He talked about accountability, healing, being a good father. He even cried, saying I was keeping him from moving forward with my bitterness. And the therapist? She nodded along, completely entranced. When I tried to bring up the stolen money, the abandonment, the nights I begged him to help, she cut me off. Redirected the conversation to forgiveness and moving forward for Emma's sake. I went home, locked myself in the bathroom, and cried harder than I had since chemo. Evan sat on the other side of the door, reminding me we had the truth, we had evidence, even if nobody wanted to see it yet. The following week, my mom bumped into Charles outside the courthouse. She lost it. Called him a pathological liar, a junkie who would never change. Rachel filed for a restraining order that same afternoon, painting my mom as a bully harassing a recovering addict. 2 days later, Dr. Mills's preliminary report came out, and it was even worse than I feared. She wrote that both parents were capable, but flagged my resistance to co-parenting as a concern. Her recommendation? Increase Charles's visitation. Move from supervised visits at the center to unsupervised afternoons twice a week. Starting immediately. Brennan told me we could appeal. But he warned it would make me look even more resistant to co-parenting. So we had to swallow it. And keep documenting. The next week, I went on a mission. I started calling nurses from the oncology ward, women who had seen Charles stumble and hide during my chemo sessions. 3 of them said they'd sign affidavits about what they'd witnessed. For a second I thought, finally. Some proof that can't be spun into a redemption story. But then hospital legal got involved. They told the nurses that getting dragged into a custody case could jeopardize their jobs. Just like that, 2 backed out immediately and the 3rd never called me back. I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me. Emma's first unsupervised visit was supposed to be harmless, a trip to the park. Instead, she came home sticky with chocolate on her face and dress, babbling about some house with lots of people, where Daddy's friends gave her candy. My heart stopped. When Brennan brought it up in court, Charles smirked and said Emma was just confused. Kids make things up. And the kicker? Jennifer, the court-appointed evaluator, actually wrote in her notes that I might be coaching Emma to say negative things. That night, I downloaded a recording app on my phone, desperate. At the next pickup, I caught Charles telling Emma that Evan wasn't her real family, and that real families don't have 2 daddies. Brennan said it was good evidence, but reminded me, Wisconsin is a 2-party consent state. If I wasn't careful, it could backfire and make me look like a stalker instead of a mother trying to protect her child. Then Tommy called again. This time his voice was shaky. Charles had stormed into the warehouse drunk and threatened him for betraying family. Tommy finally said enough was enough. He agreed to testify and handed us records showing Charles had been fired for stealing tools and selling them, not laid off like he'd been claiming. Meanwhile, Emma, she broke me. One night during her bath, she looked up with those big brown eyes and asked, "Mommy, why does Daddy say you're mean to him when he loves you so much?" I sat on the bathroom floor, speechless. How do you explain addiction and manipulation to a 3-year-old without making her father sound like a monster? The therapist had warned me, disparaging the other parent counts as emotional abuse. So I swallowed the truth and said, sometimes grown-ups just see things differently. Then I dried her off with her dinosaur towel, fighting back tears. The next week in family therapy, Charles sat across from me, spinning his web. He told the therapist I'd poisoned his entire family against him, that Tommy was only testifying because I'd manipulated him too. The therapist nodded, scribbling notes about competitive parenting. And there was Emma sitting between us, coloring flowers, while her father painted me as the villain. Then Rachel struck again. She dumped a stack of papers on us, thicker than a phone book, demanding every single work schedule I'd had for the last 5 years. She highlighted every 12-hour shift, every weekend I worked, scrawling notes in the margins about how absent mothers lose custody. Can you imagine? Me working double shifts to pay for Charles's third rehab, and now that was being used against me. My lawyer argued those hours had been for Charles's treatment. Rachel waved her hand like it was irrelevant. Dr. Vasquez finally took the stand. And thank God for her. She came armed with a binder full of dates, receipts, Uber confirmations when I couldn't afford hospital parking, photos of me passed out in a chemo chair alone. For 2 hours, she testified that she'd watched me fight cancer with no support, while Charles was supposedly in recovery. And then Charles pulled his next stunt. He brought his new AA sponsor to court. This man spoke for 40 minutes straight about what a shining star Charles was in recovery. Honest. Dedicated. Inspiring. The judge nodded along like she was watching an after-school special. This man had no idea Charles once stole from the collection basket at those very meetings. But the worst moment came at a custody exchange. Charles bent to tie Emma's shoe and something slipped out of his jacket pocket. A syringe. He snatched it up immediately, shoving it back into his pocket with a shaky laugh, claiming it was an EpiPen for his new peanut allergy. Right. Because apparently now he was allergic to legumes. Emma, wide-eyed, asked, "What's the pointy thing, Daddy?" I pulled out my phone and snapped pictures while he fumbled over excuses about medical conditions he'd never had before. Brennan immediately filed for drug testing. Rachel went nuclear, claiming we were harassing a recovering addict. She even threatened to file complaints against my lawyer, saying forcing a drug test was like asking a cancer patient to prove they weren't lying about their illness. And here's the crazy part, the judge actually considered it. In the end, the judge ordered both of us to take drug tests within 24 hours to be fair. I was clean, of course. Charles? He passed too. Which made me look like some paranoid woman trying to frame her ex. That night, Tommy called me crying. He confessed Charles had been bragging for weeks about carrying fake urine just in case. The next morning, Charles filed emergency papers. He claimed I was mentally unstable from PTSD, that cancer treatments had made me paranoid, and that I was creating false accusations that were damaging Emma's relationship with her father. He wanted Emma full-time, with me reduced to supervised visits once a month. When my oncology unit heard, they rallied like soldiers going to war. 5 nurses and 2 doctors called Brennan, offering to testify. But the judge limited us to just 1 witness. Once again, only Dr. Vasquez was allowed to speak, even though the others had seen everything too. 10 weeks in, Emma came home from daycare with a drawing. A rainbow. 3 people holding hands, me, her, and Evan. When the teacher asked where Daddy was, Emma shrugged and said, "He's at the place with the strangers where they sit in a circle and talk about being sad." My heart broke into pieces. That same week, Brennan called me into his office. He had something on his laptop that made my stomach drop. Charles had been recording our phone calls for months, editing them to make me sound unhinged. In one clip, when Emma had the flu and I'd worked a 12-hour shift, he cut out the part where I asked him 3 times to pick her up from daycare. What was left? Just me, exhausted, saying those 4 words, "You never helped me." The digital forensics expert Brennan hired showed us 17 more doctored recordings. You could literally see the splices in the audio waves. The worst one? A night I'd called Charles in tears after a suspicious mammogram. The original? Him dismissing me, saying I was dramatic about nothing. The edited version? He made it sound like I was hysterical over Emma spilling juice on the carpet. The expert said she could prove all the manipulation in court. But it would cost another $10,000 for a full forensic report and testimony. Evan and I were already drowning in fees. That night, his parents knocked on our door with a check for $15,000. His mom held my hands, eyes shining with tears, and told me they'd even started paperwork to mortgage their house if we needed more. These people had only known me for 2 years, and they were willing to risk their retirement. Meanwhile, Charles's own family wouldn't give him a couch to crash on. 3 months into this nightmare, the guardian ad litem interviewed Emma at daycare. The teacher pulled me aside later and whispered that Emma had grabbed a toy syringe from the doctor's playset, pressed it against her arm, and said something about Daddy's special medicine. My stomach twisted. But the guardian's report brushed it off, said kids misinterpret things. Maybe she'd seen vitamins or allergy shots. 2 weeks later, we had our first session with a high-conflict custody counselor. Charles sat there for 20 minutes talking about how abandoned he'd felt during my cancer treatment. Then, suddenly, he started rattling off exact details about my chemo schedule, the same schedule he'd always claimed not to remember. The therapist asked how he knew it was every 3rd Thursday if he'd never gone with me. He stammered something about checking my calendar. The therapist made a note. For once, maybe he'd slipped. That night at 2 in the morning, Evan shook me awake. He'd heard a car engine idling outside. Charles's car. Parked across the street, lights off, just watching. Evan called the cops, but they shrugged it off. No restraining order meant a father has the right to drive by his child's home. The very next morning, Tommy called Brennan's office with screenshots of texts Charles had sent him 6 months earlier. Messages bragging about documenting everything for the custody battle. One line burned into my brain, her stupid cancer card won't work in court anymore. Rachel tried to get the texts thrown out, saying Tommy was biased because Charles had stolen from him. But this time the judge allowed them in with a warning to consider the source. For weeks later, an unmarked envelope showed up at Brennan's office. No return address. Inside? A flash drive. When we opened it, my stomach twisted. It was full of AA meeting recordings from 2 years ago. And guess what? Charles's own sponsor had recorded them for the group archives. 3 different meetings, clear as day, time-stamped, his voice undeniable. And in those recordings, Charles admitted he was still using drugs during my chemo. Not just that, he actually bragged about planning to take Emma away from me as payback for kicking him out. The worst part? He had signed a consent form agreeing to the meetings being recorded for group purposes. He couldn't even hide behind confidentiality. His own voice had betrayed him. That same afternoon, Emma's play therapist called. She sounded shaken. Emma had used her dolls to act out a scene, Daddy giving himself shots in the bathroom, then telling the mommy doll she was mean and crazy. The therapist said she had to report it to the guardian ad litem immediately. My heart broke in two. The next morning, Brennan filed a motion to admit the AA recordings into evidence. Rachel? She absolutely lost it. She kept screaming about confidentiality, about sacred trust in recovery groups. But the judge cut her off cold. He reminded her that Charles himself had already dragged AA witnesses into court. If Charles wanted to play that card, the whole deck was fair game. A new hearing was scheduled 3 weeks out to review the evidence. Evan took off work to sit beside me in court that day. We watched the forensics expert plug his laptop in and play Charles's edited recordings side by side with the originals. In the uncut versions, you could hear me crying, begging Charles to get help, for Emma's sake, for our family. In his doctored versions? He'd spliced and rearranged everything to make it sound like I was threatening him. Rachel tried to spin it as differences in perspective, but even she looked uncomfortable as the expert showed the audio waves, jagged gaps where Charles had chopped up words and glued them together. It was undeniable manipulation. That same week, the visitation monitor submitted her report. And it made me sick to my stomach. She wrote that during his supervised visits, Charles kept grilling Emma with strange questions about Evan. Does Evan yell at mommy? Are you ever scared when Evan is around? And Emma, God bless her, just kept telling him about the butterflies Evan was teaching her to paint on her bedroom wall. A child trying to talk about art, while her father tried to twist her words into weapons. 4 months into this nightmare, Jennifer, the guardian ad litem, finally submitted her full report. She said Emma should stay in therapy, and that Charles's behavior showed concerning patterns that had to be addressed. Her recommendation? Keep visits supervised only. That's when Charles finally snapped. Right there in the courtroom, he stood up and started screaming that I'd poison everyone against him, even his own daughter. The bailiff had to step forward before Charles finally collapsed back into his chair, red-faced and shaking. Everyone in that room saw his mask slip that day. Judge Hoffman looked troubled. She ordered another continuation to review all the evidence, but still muttered that recovery deserves compassion. Compassion. For the man who had abandoned me through cancer and now tried to erase me from my daughter's life. 2 days later, my phone rang at midnight. County jail again. Charles had been arrested for another DUI. Blood alcohol level, 0.18. And this time, the police found Emma's car seat in the back. Thank God she hadn't been with him. Where was he arrested? Parked outside my house. Watching. The next morning, Rachel filed to withdraw from his case, citing irreconcilable differences. Translation? Even she couldn't spin this disaster anymore. Charles ended up with a baby-faced public defender who looked like he should have been worrying about prom, not custody law. Once his visits were suspended after that DUI, something incredible happened. Emma finally started sleeping through the night again. The nightmares stopped. She stopped asking about Daddy's medicine. Her appetite came back. Evan would tuck her in, read her bedtime stories, and for the first time in months I heard her laugh again, real laughter, not that nervous little giggle she'd been hiding behind. But Charles wasn't done spiraling. His new lawyer begged for 30 days to review the case, and the judge granted it. More waiting. Meanwhile, Charles showed up at my hospital during one of my shifts, screaming in the emergency department that I had set him up. He was drunk. Security dragged him out while he shouted that I'd ruined his life. The hospital banned him from the property and my supervisor filed a police report. And then the stalking started. My mom began noticing his beat-up Honda parked at the end of our street almost every night. She took photos, time-stamped, documented everything. The third time, she marched right up to his window and knocked. He peeled off before she could say a word. When we filed for a restraining order, the judge shrugged it off, said parking on a public street wasn't harassment. Meanwhile, Brennan finally got the AA recordings admitted. I sat in court, listening to Charles's own voice. He laughed as he told his group how he played the victim during my cancer treatment. How he knew exactly what he was doing when he stayed away, feeding me excuses about medical triggers. The judge's face changed when she heard that laugh. For the first time, maybe she understood. Then, the biggest shock of all, Charles's own parents called my lawyer. They wanted to testify. They drove up from Florida with boxes of receipts and bank statements showing how Charles had stolen from them during the exact months he swore he was sober. Credit cards, jewelry, even his grandmother's wedding ring. His mother sobbed as she showed me the pawnshop slip, dated just 2 days after my very first chemo treatment. The guardian ad litem interviewed Emma 3 more times after that. Each session worse than the last. Emma started parroting phrases no 4-year-old should know, things like mommy's mean and mommy lies. When asked where she'd heard them, she whispered, Daddy taught me. Jennifer finally recommended supervised visits only, with a professional monitor present at all times to document coaching. By then, Evan had taken time off to sit beside me at every appointment, every recital. At Emma's little dance show, Pink Tutu, Disney song in the background, she twirled on stage, smiling wide, and never once looked around for her dad. Not once. 2 weeks later, Tommy called me in a panic. At the warehouse, he discovered packages addressed to fake names. Security footage showed Charles picking them up with a copied spare key. They traced back to an online pharmacy shipping out pills without prescriptions. Tommy turned everything over to the police and to my lawyer. Charles's DUI case moved forward, and his lawyer pushed for a no-contest plea. The judge gave him probation and 90 days in rehab, with 6 months in county if he failed. Brennan said this actually helped us, it showed ongoing substance abuse. But then, during discovery, we hit gold. On one of Charles's seized computers, they found forum posts. Hundreds of them. A divorced dads group under a fake name, but describing our situation word for word. Asking for advice on beating the system. People told him to claim parental alienation, to document everything I did. One even suggested he hurt himself and blame me. And Charles responded. Over 200 pages printed, posts where he admitted he was still using, but just needed to look clean long enough to get custody. Then came the rehab reports. Within the first month, Charles failed 3 drug tests. Staff found pills hidden in his room, caught him trying to buy from other patients. He was kicked out, automatic probation violation. A bench warrant went out for his arrest. The family court judge pulled both lawyers into chambers and spent 2 hours combing through everything, the AA tapes, Tommy's evidence, the forum posts. When she came back out, her face looked pale. She said she was deeply troubled by what she'd seen. And though she didn't rule yet, she suspended Charles's visitation until a final decision. 6 months of depositions, hearings, endless paperwork later, we finally got to trial. Charles walked in looking gaunt, like he'd lost 30 pounds. His suit hung off him like it belonged to someone else. His new lawyer stood tall, talking about addiction being a disease, insisting Charles deserved one more chance to prove himself as a father. Then it was our turn. Dr. Vasquez took the stand first. She told the court how she'd watched me drag myself to chemo alone, check myself out against medical advice because I had to get back to my toddler. She described finding me collapsed in a hospital bathroom, dehydrated, trying to keep Emma safe while poison pumped through my veins. Charles didn't look up once. His hands just shook under the table. Then his parents testified. His mother's voice broke as she described finding Charles unconscious in their bathroom during my 3rd round of chemo. She'd gone to grab the medication they'd been holding for me, my pain pills, and found the bottle empty beside her son's limp body. Paramedics had to hit him with Narcan twice to bring him back. And while all that was happening, I was at home on the bathroom floor, puking from chemo, trying to keep our daughter entertained with coloring books. When the trial finally reached its peak, my lawyer laid everything out. The edited recordings, the timelines Tommy had pieced together, the proof that Charles hadn't just stumbled into this custody war, he'd been planning it for years. The IT expert took the stand, pointing to the screen where he showed side-by-side comparisons, Charles's fakes versus the originals. In Charles's doctored files, I sounded hysterical, unhinged. In the originals? It was him screaming while I stayed calm. His lawyer objected again and again, but the judge let it all in. And then Charles himself took the stand. That's when it all unraveled. Under oath, he admitted he'd been using throughout my cancer treatment. He tried to soften it, said he was different now. My lawyer asked him directly, "Are you sober today?" He said yes, but his pupils were blown wide and he kept wiping his nose. She pressed again. He started crying. And then he admitted it, he'd used that very morning just to calm his nerves for court. The judge's face went cold. She ordered an immediate recess. Out in the hallway, Charles's mother came to me, tears streaking her face. She gripped my hands and whispered that she should have spoken up years ago. That fear had kept her quiet. That she understood if I never wanted to see her again. When court resumed, Charles's probation officer testified. His drug test that morning had come back positive for methamphetamines. A direct violation of his probation. Emma's therapist followed, submitting a report showing exactly how much damage these supervised visits had done to her, nightmares, bedwetting, fear. And how much better she was once the visits stopped. On the final day, the judge asked Charles about those AA recordings Tommy had dug up. He tried to wiggle out of it, kept contradicting himself, stumbling over dates, until finally he broke down, sobbing that he couldn't remember what was real anymore. My lawyer's closing argument hit like a hammer. She laid out the pattern, not isolated mistakes but a history of choices that endangered us while I was fighting for my life. She pointed to the board covered in timelines, police reports, medical records. This, she told the judge, is not the story of recovery. This is the story of manipulation. Charles's lawyer shuffled his papers like a man already defeated. His voice cracked as he talked about addiction being a disease, about second chances. But he knew. Everyone knew. His words got smaller and smaller until he sat down. Charles grabbed his arm so hard it left marks. And then silence. The hum of the AC, the only sound as Judge Hoffman finally looked Charles dead in the eye. She said she'd seen plenty of cases in her career, but this one stood out for its extraordinary deception. She said he had weaponized recovery to manipulate the system. Her voice sharpened when she mentioned the medical records, how I sat through chemo alone while he documented fake abuse. The ruling, I was granted sole legal and physical custody. No visitation. None. Not until Charles completed treatment and stayed clean for 1 full year, with verified testing. Charles shot to his feet so fast his chair crashed backward. He screamed that I'd destroyed his life, stolen his daughter, turned everyone against him. The judge banged her gavel. The bailiff stepped in. Charles hurled insults at me, swore Emma would hate me someday. And then his probation violation sealed it, missed drug tests, failed screens. They cuffed him right there in the courtroom. Outside, Brennan told me it was over. The ruling was ironclad. No appeals for at least a year. I stood in the parking lot with Evan and my mom. No cheers, no smiles, just exhausted relief. A week later, Emma sat at the kitchen table coloring rainbows and asked about Daddy. I told her he was sick and needed to get better, the same way Mommy did during cancer. She nodded once and went back to her crayons. That night, the legal bill arrived, $47,000. Evan and I sat at the table making a 5-year payment plan. We agreed it was worth every penny, for Emma's safety, for our peace. Charles's mother showed up that weekend with a birthday gift for Emma and old photos of him as a boy. She said she'd respect whatever relationship we allowed, separate from her son. And Tommy called later, saying Charles was in a state-run facility now, but he doubted it would stick. 3 months later, I testified at Charles's probation hearing. For the first time, I told it all with no filters, no strategy. The bathroom floor. The bleeding. The nights alone during chemo. The promises broken, the needles, the abandonment. The judge sentenced him to 6 months in jail, then mandatory inpatient rehab. His parental rights stayed suspended. And before I left, the criminal court judge stood and told me I was brave, for protecting Emma. 2 weeks later, Jennifer came for her last home visit. She couldn't stop smiling as she watched Emma build towers with her blocks. No nightmares. Eating 3 meals and snacks. Talking more. Making friends. My little girl was safe again. That Monday, I returned to work full-time. No emergency hearings. No supervised visits. No late-night lawyer calls. My supervisor hugged me and said I looked like the nurse she hired 5 years ago, not the ghost I'd become. Evan and I started therapy too. The counselor told us something that stuck. We'd been surviving Charles's chaos for so long, we forgot how to live in peace. And slowly, we began to remember. Weeks later, we got a letter from Charles's new lawyer, no more appeals. He was focusing on recovery. Short, formal, Emma's name not mentioned once. September came. Emma started preschool at the little building with the bright yellow door. I braced for tears, clinging, but she ran straight to the dress-up corner and plopped a crown on her head. I stood there watching, unable to move until the teacher gently told me I could probably leave. That afternoon, I pulled out my old wedding ring for the first time in 2 years. The pawn shop gave me $800 for it. Straight into Emma's college fund to start rebuilding what Charles had drained. My mom flew back to Florida after 6 months of living with us. At the airport, she hugged me tight and whispered, "You're a better mother than I ever was, because you actually protected your child." In October, a nursing conference asked me to speak about recognizing abuse in healthcare settings. I stood at a podium in front of 300 nurses and told them everything, the chemo chairs, the lies, the manipulation. How abusers twist systems to their advantage. Not a single person looked away for 20 straight minutes. And tonight I stand in Emma's doorway with Evan. We watch her sleeping, her stuffed elephant tucked under her chin. No nightmares. No tears. Just peace. The court orders are filed away. Charles's promises? Just echoes that don't hurt anymore. We won. Thanks for watching. Today's train wreck is over, but tomorrow's ride is already on track. Subscribe so you don't miss it.